You know, people used to harp on Disney all the time, but at least in terms of their feature films, they've really stepped up their game since 2009 and The Princess and the Frog, which started what might end up being considered the second Disney Renaissance. It seems as though they've taken all the good stuff from Disney's golden age, the first Renaissance in Pixar, and have been using it to build a new brand identity, and for the first time in a long time, I'm actually excited to see what Disney is going to come out with next. Wreck-It Ralph just happens to be the best film of this new era of Disney yet. Incidentally, it's also the most Pixar-like film the studio has produced, though comparing it to Toy Story, like many are doing, is not entirely accurate. It'd be closer to consider it a blending of Toy Story, with its world building and what happens to something when you're not watching concept, and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, with its mishmash style of celebration of retro media, its many background blink or you'll miss it cameos of characters, and a similar mystery plot and reveal, which isn't as big a spoiler, I just made that sound. The titular Wreck-It Ralph is the villain character of a now 30-year-old Donkey Kong wannabe called Fix-It Felix Jr. in a somehow still standing arcade. However, after 30 years, Ralph is starting to question his role within the world of the games. He's tired of being the bad guy, so to prove his worth, he starts jumping to other games to prove himself. First to a rail shooter Gears of War patch called Hero's Duty, and then a sugary sweet kart racing game called Sugar Rush, where he both inadvertently stumbles upon a conspiracy involving Sugar Rush's roster of characters, and inadvertently starting the events that would result in the video game equivalent of the apocalypse. First off, to put aside a fear that may have kept people away from this film, there is no overuse of retro characters, and it certainly doesn't rely on knowing who these characters are. All the main characters are original. The retro character with the biggest role is probably Q*bert, and that's just to get plot information to certain characters and offer an example of what happens to game characters when their game becomes unplugged and removed from the arcade. These character cameos are just that. Cameos for people old enough to remember Street Fighter, Altered Beast, and Tapper that don't actually affect the film. At its core, Wreck-It Ralph is about social roles and how we place ourselves in them, whether we take what is given to us or try to push past towards a more valued role. This kind of story is actually a hallmark of Pixar, informing virtually every film they've done. Earlier Disney films occasionally played lip service to this, but the difference in those films is that their characters wanted possession of a singular thing or singular person without so much changing themselves. Ariel wants the love of Prince Eric. While she's fascinated with the world above, her only actual motivation for staying up there is the love of a singular human being. She has no interest in actually changing herself. Pixar movies are typically about characters trying to better themselves or discover things about themselves they never knew. In Pixar movies, characters actually change or attempt to change, and that's what drives the story. Wreck-It Ralph is this, but it does it with a bit of bait and switch, with Ralph first attempting to obtain something physical, in this case a medal, only to discover that he's changing himself and those around him. It's the journey that matters, not the actual goal. In that sense, Wreck-It Ralph is probably the best video game movie ever. Not because it's a quality adaptation of a pre-existing video game title, but because it successfully replicates the classic video game narrative. Actually, winning a retro game will usually get you something as meaningless as a game over screen, and you're usually lucky if it's even properly translated. That's not what's important in video games. What's actually important is your personal satisfaction in your actions, in making the right choices and overcoming the game's obstacles. It's our action within the game that define our experience within it, as it is Ralph's actions within this film that define him. And to top it off, it's genuinely funny, this being directed by Rich Moore from the Simpsons and Futurama family. It's very well animated with a wide variety of worlds and palettes to draw from, and the voice acting is top-notch. John C. Reilly, Sarah Silverman, Jack McBrayer, and Jane Lynch all turn in their A-game for this, and watching them play off each other is a blast. Oh, and since this is the first episode of all the movies, I should point out that, if I can help it, I don't watch the 3D versions of anything. Partially because it's more expensive for me, partially because 3D is a horrible gimmick that needs to die, partially because it gives me a headache, and partially because it's uncomfortable when you're already wearing glasses. But no, that's just me. Your mileage may vary. Wreck-It Ralph is one of those films that I could just go on forever about, something I'd love to break down into further analysis when it comes out to DVD. But for now, just take my recommendation. Wreck-It Ralph is the best kids film of 2012, and you should see it while you still can. I have to be honest, I'm not an authority on James Bond. I have seen a grand total of 12 Bond films, just half of them. I've seen a little bit of every era of Bond, from Sean Connery to Daniel Craig, but I have not seen all the films of any one Bond actor except Craig and, of course, George Lazenby. Out of all of Ian Fleming's original 007 novels, I've only read Casino Royale, though I've skimmed a few others. I can't say I am either a James Bond fan or a James Bond detractor. I accept it as an institution, but can't tell you what James Bond is supposed to be. Such is the split between fans during this Daniel Craig era of the film series, which celebrated its 50th anniversary with Skyfall, the 23rd Bond film and the third starring Craig. Many people have gone against the Craig era of Bond, which has anchored itself as a more realistic and gritty version. On one hand, this is a film series that has modeled itself around stylized action, heteroerotic eye candy, corny one-liners, and megalomaniac gimmicky villains. And when they toss those elements aside in the Casino Royale film, I can understand why some might be worried the series was losing its identity and falling into the trap of making, quote, serious action film, unquote, in the same vein as the Christopher Nolan Batman films, or in the case of Quantum of Solace, the Jason Bourne films. On the other hand, by this time, those elements had become stale and were getting in the way of making a good movie. Trying to stick too closely to these elements is just about what killed the series in the Pierce Brosnan era. It was clear that they needed to find a new direction, and in my opinion, the reboot with Casino Royale was the right option. Doesn't hurt that Casino Royale is also totally awesome. In fact, the Daniel Craig era is much closer to the Ian Fleming version of the character, with a Bond that is self-doubting, confrontational, and sometimes an outright psychopath. So I suppose the question Skyfall sets itself up to answer is there room for the more classic James Bond film elements in this more serious version of Bond that is closer to Ian Fleming than Eon Productions? The answer is, thankfully, yes, as Skyfall is both a great third film for this new era and a wonderful throwback to what came before, taking what was great about both and blending them into what I have to say is my favorite Bond film that I've seen to date. In Skyfall, James Bond finds himself doubting his abilities after a mission goes south and he gets shot and is presumed dead, returning only to discover that MI6, and specifically its head, M, played by Judi Dench, is under attack by a mysterious cyber terrorist, and Bond, warts and all, is brought back to try and track this person down. On the side of the Daniel Craig era, Skyfall continues the tradition of having Craig's Bond be the most three-dimensional and interesting out of all of them, this time showing us Bond at his emotional lowest, and delving deeper into Bond's history than we've ever gone before, perhaps to the annoyance of fan theorists. But even better, Judi Dench's M has something to do. In fact, the film is just as much about her as it is about Bond, about her as a character and about her place, along with the 00 program, within the greater, wider ideals of Queen and Country. Judi Dench is a great actress, and it's great to see her do more in a Bond film than 4 minutes of exposition, and it doesn't hurt that what's here is really interesting. And all this builds to a final act that wasn't at all hinted in the previews of the film, so I won't hint to it either. As for classical James Bond elements, they are brought back slowly and tempered in a more realistic fashion, but they are still undeniably classic Bond. One of the biggest returns to form is bringing back Q, this time played by Ben Whishaw, the quartermaster who gives Bond all of his elaborate gadgets. Like M, Q plays a bigger part in the plot than he has in any Bond film previous. The gadgets presented aren't exactly exploding pens and invisible cars, but that's made up for the fact that their use in helping Bond is cleverly subverted. Other characters from Bond's past films also appear, but to get in that would be spoilers. But perhaps the biggest thing to come back is the larger-than-life Bond villain, this time a guy named Silva, played by... Okay, look, you've come to this channel long enough to know that I am not going to pronounce that name correctly, especially when it's one of those weird names where the J is supposed to make the H sound. But suffice it to say, he's good. He's really good. In fact, Silva, a man with a past connection to M, is probably going to go down as one of the most memorable Bond villains of all time, right up there with Goldfinger and Blofeld. He's hell of intimidating, clearly the most intelligent man in the room, and one step ahead of everyone. Special attention needs to be brought to the action scenes. Gone is the shaky cam and overabundance of CGI from Quantum of Solace. We're back to mostly tripods and live stunts, and it's arguably the best action film all year. From the opening chase over the rooftops of Istanbul, to brawls in a floating casino with Komodo dragons, to the finale back in jolly old England, there is never a dull moment. Who knew Sam Mendes, known for midlife crisis dramas like American Beauty and Revolutionary Road, would be such an amazing action director? There's really something here for any kind of James Bond fan. Those who like classic Bond tropes will be tickled pink by their return, and those who like the more serious and true to Ian Fleming style of Bond is going to get perhaps the best realization of that yet. Pretty much the only people who shouldn't see this are people who just flat out don't like James Bond. There's a lot of talk every year of Oscar bait, and what that means to us as a film audience. Does, in fact, a film made with elements that are common among Academy Award-winning films detract from it? It's probably true that some films get made exclusively to please Academy voters, which is largely older men with a hard-on for historical epics, middle-aged actors, and grand characterizations ripped straight from the first couple of pages of TV tropes. But I don't think that should really concern us, the casual audience who are in no way involved with the Academy. That a film might be pining for an award is something that is completely immaterial to the actual quality of the film, as it is the advertisements or the cleanliness of the multiplex lobby. These things shouldn't concern us. What matters is the film. Is the film good, with or without any Academy baggage? And Lincoln is okay. I really thought it was just okay. Jeez, I set up this big defense for you, Lincoln, and you just have to go around being okay. I suppose the problem for me was that I felt like the film was trying to be two things that didn't go completely together. The first of these things, and the one that might surprise you, is political drama. By which I don't mean it has politics in it. It's a film about the 16th President of the United States. Of course it's going to have politics in it. But it's almost nothing but politics, and the gritty details of politics at that. Lincoln takes place in the final days of the Civil War, and now it's not a matter of who will win, but when will the South finally surrender. Abraham Lincoln, having just won a second term, sees the end of the war as a setback for passing the 13th Amendment that would abolish slavery, which was brought out as a way to end the Civil War early, and he has to work fast to get the required majority of the House to get it passed, kicking off 2 hours of debates, deals, bribes, and appeals. It's a surprisingly realistic look at politics, not sugarcoating things. We see Lincoln and his supporters, those on the side of chucking slavery into the wastebin, have to resort to less than angelic means to get the job done. Anyone who knows me knows my affinity for stories that don't play in the black and white and stick to the gray side of things. Those opposing the amendments don't quite get the same dignity, but I suppose fairly presenting the other side of the argument is difficult when the issue is rightfully seen nowadays as the complete evil blight it was. Still, pretty much everyone opposing the bill are either shifty-eyed schemers or bullied into the position by said shifty-eyed schemers. I mean, I'm not offering any solutions here. It's not even really an objection. I'm just pointing out the imbalance in seeing those who are opposing the amendment bribing people as an injustice, while seeing someone on Lincoln's team bribing someone with hijink music. So we have a more detailed-oriented, politically focused historical piece, almost a 19th century West Wing. I like that. I like that this presumed Lincoln biopic focuses almost entirely on a month of his life. A true birth-to-death biopic has to paint itself in broad strokes and get past so many events with lightning speed. But these films, like Lincoln and the upcoming Hitchcock, are focused on detailed snapshots of a time, and allow you to get more intimate with both the man and the history. And yet, contrary to this, we still have a film that likes to paint with big brushes. For every technical detail in the story, there's a moment of a character making a near operatic gesture or a line of dialogue. Characters speak as if what they're saying at that moment is always the most important thing ever said. They sit and gesture or stand and face someone as if it is the most important thing ever done. The dialogue, the framing of a scene, the motions of the actors all spell to that Oscar bait aesthetic that people tend to complain about. And they're doing this over these tinier moments and details. Have you seen those real actors read Yelp videos? Okay, it's not as funny or of a contrast as that, but the effect is nevertheless jarring. What we end up with might as well be the three tenors singing a college history textbook. What's lost in all of this is any sense of genuine humanity. There's very few scenes where the characters are allowed to breathe and simply exist. In fact, I can only think of two scenes off the top of my head, one happening early on when Lincoln finds his son asleep on the floor and takes him to his bedroom. There's not nearly enough of that kind of stuff, not enough contrast to the big capital P politics going on. Which is not a slight against the acting, easily the film's biggest strength. I'm sure you've heard by now just how amazing Daniel Day-Lewis is as Abraham Lincoln, and it's all pretty much true. This is the most complex and interesting Lincoln we've seen in film, and at times as much the larger-than-life icon we've come to know him as, at times very, very human, and the switching between these two Lincolns doesn't come off as unnatural. But what's less talked about is the supporting cast, which do just as much heavy lifting as Lewis. Sally Field, David Strathairn, James Spader, Jackie Earle Haley, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt are just a few in a list of wonderful actors who somehow managed to prop up this oddly contrasting film. But the real standout, at least for me, is Tommy Lee Jones as abolitionist Thaddeus Stevens. When I saw Men in Black 3 earlier this year, and saw just how dead he seemed in it, I was beginning to wonder if Jones even gets anything out of acting anymore. Well, my worries have been swept away. This is the most alive I've seen Jones in a long time. You made a believer out of me, Jones. Bravo. So, a terrific cast, a sharp contrast between style and substance, beautiful imagery with sometimes too on-the-nose symbolism, a bit overlong, showing us the perfect ending to the film and then going on for another 10 minutes. Add it all together, and you end up with a film that I felt was just okay. In fact, that's pretty much my relationship with Steven Spielberg in a nutshell. Just okay. It's over! It's finally over. One of the biggest institutions of bad storytelling has finally reached its zenith, and in a way I never expected, with what appears to be a final thesis on the Twilight franchise by the people behind this film, and hopefully an awakening within its fanbase. Perhaps I speak more poetically than a review of Twilight deserves, but the fact is, it really does feel like everything was building up to this moment. I won't bother too much getting into what made the Twilight books and the film series so bad. So many other people have put it in their crosshairs, many of them more thoughtful and smarter than I am. Yes, Stephenie Meyer can't write for crap. Yes, she has no idea how relationships work. Her idea of love is something so twisted and nasty from the real thing. Yes, the Twilight books are nothing more than shitty, overhyped Harlequin romance novels. Yes, the films are making shit tons of money, but look like they have about a $5,000 budget. Yes, the special effects are shit. Yes, the acting is universally wooden and dead. Yes, there are no stakes, no real conflicts. Yes, the series ends in a total whimper. I've really kind of gone out of my way to avoid Twilight. I mean, I've seen all the films, read the first book, and read summaries of the other three, but I've tried to keep myself away from both the fan base and the hater base. I don't get into discussions about it if I can help it, under the foolhardy philosophy that if you ignore something long enough, it'll go away. Hence why I haven't seen Transformers 2 and 3 and refuse to justify that franchise with my time. And yet, I kinda wish I did, as this film makes the entire experience worth it. First off, director Bill Condon, who also directed the previous installment, seems the most capable out of all the directors in this franchise to squeeze as much camp and enjoyment out of the proceedings. Breaking Dawn Part 1 and 2 are the most willing to play ball and ham it up, as if the director was taking a cue from Michael Sheen. In this film, we have everything from superpowered slapstick to an orgasm realized on screen with CGI sparkles, cabins that look like they were lifted directly from a Thomas Kinkade painting, Jacob getting nude in front of Bella's dad, every scene with Michael Sheen. There's just way too much camp to laugh at. There has to be at least a partial awareness from the people behind the camera just how crap the whole Twilight thing is. Robert Pattinson certainly knows. There's a video making the rounds on YouTube right now that put together all the Twilight bashing he's done in interviews. I really doubt Bill Condon, a man who's made perfectly solid films in the past, or anyone else behind the production, had their heads in the sand. That said, a lot of the problems we're used to by now are still there. the acting is lifeless. Taylor Lautner needs to go the fuck away. The CGI is crap and weird, especially when they decide to put a creepy computer-generated face on a baby. And a lot of the film are the characters just standing around a living room waiting for the plot to happen. The plot being that the Volturi, the vampire organization that runs everything, has gotten wind of Bella and Edward's daughter and assumes she's an immortal child, which is something that is both dangerous and very illegal. So the Volturi plan to arrive and destroy the child and everyone involved with its creations. And for the first time, it seems like there's actually going to be conflict for this series, that something is actually at stake, that something is going to happen. And then it does happen. If you've seen the movie or seen any other review before this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And what's important about this is it didn't happen in the book. Without delving into too many spoilers, the novel for Breaking Dawn ends in the most pathetic, lame duck, no consequences ending. In the film, they instead have a fight scene, a glorious super-powered fight scene with beloved characters actually dying, things actually happening, actions actually having consequences, and the audience went crazy. I saw this film a few days after it opened, so there was a healthy crowd of Twilight fangirls in the audience. At this point, you have to imagine that the films have become an obligation to them, that they're just going through the motions. There was a lot less oohing and aahing over Edward and Jacob than I've seen at screenings of previous films. There was a general air of, let's get this over with, at least in my audience. And then this change from the book happened, and they went fucking nuts. Just total batshit crazy. Crying over their favorite characters getting killed. Cheering for each bad guy that gets offed. And all in a very violent, gruesome way, too. Lots of heads getting torn off, as pretty much the only way to kill a vampire. The audience was suddenly and rapidly invested with what was going on. And then, poof, it turns out it didn't actually happen. Visions of what might be, and we get the ending from the book. But the audience got hushed by this. A few cried out bullshit. Nobody clapped at the end of the film. This is what I mean by awakening. Those who were entering puberty at the beginning of this franchise are just now entering maturity. And with that comes a maturity in taste and thinking skills. And this might be, I truly hope, the thing that drives them over the edge and turns them into people who approach media and art with intelligence and rationality. They've basically given them a better one or better two test, showing them a comparison between the non-ending from the book versus an ending where actual things happen and there's actual stakes and consequences and interesting stuff. And hopefully they realize that their vision isn't that great. And it seems like my audience chose the latter. They chose the fight scene. I can only hope that they look at their copies of Breaking Dawn, reread that ending, and go, wow, why did I like this so much? I need to be more careful about the kind of things I get myself caught up in. Wishful thinking? Perhaps. We're never going to lose Twilight-style fan bases. New, vulnerable generations will simply latch on to the next big thing. But with one fight scene, there is a chance that this generation might be saved from themselves.